Hello, yeah, I just watched that documentary, and after watching it, my understanding on the global issues facing different regions and cultures has changed. Especially I wasn't aware of the permafrost leaving. I've heard of before and read a little somewhat extensively about like how much carbon is stored in ice and kind of like how I believe it was the Russian guy was talking about, and like there all that grass, and if that gets converted to CO2, it's just like would you know make that snowball grow and go even faster. And I heard that before, but I'd never seen any of the photos of like all the collapse to buildings from it and all of those issues associated with it. I'd never seen that before, and I thought that was really interesting. Also, the mountains crumbling in Switzerland from permafrost melting. I had never heard of that problem before, and like it makes a lot of sense now. But I never heard that talked about before, other than this documentary. So I thought that was very interesting and useful knowledge for me. And the audience of this documentary, um, I think this audience was definitely for people that weren't super familiar with it, or like to kind of show people that it is real. Like maybe this is what you show some people in the GOP debate that were you know denying climate change, like those type of folks who were like, oh, so what? It's getting hotter. Or like I like summer days, like that type of thing. I felt like this was definitely more curated towards that crowd. Like, cause yes, I mean, it still did go quite in depth in some categories, but definitely had a lot of like shock type of imagery and stuff that you'd use to kind of convince someone, not necessarily stuff that you use to like educate someone. Or I mean, maybe it's just not as in depth. Because I've seen other things before that are kind of much more in depth. Like for example, when it talks about like all the great steps the EU is making, I've seen some other people be a lot more critical of that and talk about like carbon buyback and like some of the things that the EU is using to like get carbon neutral and how it's not like 100% actually getting carbon neutral. They're like fudging some numbers, and they didn't even really touch on like any taxes on the wealthy, which is like by far the biggest thing. I mean, the last large European climate pact meeting was like, I think it was like a few thousand private jets flew in. And if you just look at that carbon alone, it was like a ridiculous number. So they don't really mention a lot of things that are super achievable and easy, like just taxes, uh, restrictions, like stepping away from as much of a, you know, capitalist society, I guess, because climate change is a byproduct of capitalism. They didn't really talk about that. So I think it was definitely more towards the kind of like grab someone in who doesn't believe it, or just kind of like maybe show it to a kid or something. It just seemed much more surface level, like look at these bad pictures. Still really good and important, like really well done documentary. I thought they had, like I still learned some new things. I'm someone who's probably more familiar than most, not super educated on it, but probably more familiar than most. And I still learned quite a few new things in it, so I thought it was really valuable. But I do definitely think it was more surface level, and I guess kind of didn't really want to touch on some issues, probably because the donors that paid for it are guilty of those. I think it was like BBC, and they get some oil money ties. They get some rich people that don't really want to get taxed. So I think that definitely probably plays a factor. And then for number three, particular innovation strategies used to combat climate change. And three that I thought were really interesting. The first one, this isn't necessarily in order when they popped up in the documentary, just in the order that I wrote them down. Because I was kind of trying to get only the best ones down, so I wanted to watch it, then go back and pick out my favorite ones. I don't want to go too hard too early. But the first one I really liked was the synthetic palm oil, because I thought it was really cool solution to the deforestation. Like the palm oil from algae seemed really interesting. I wish they would have touched more on specifics, like how manufacturable it is. Cause like there's a lot of things that are can be easily replaced for petroleum products, but they're more expensive, so people don't. Like for plastics, or there's like hemp plastic alternatives. It's just expensive, so they don't do it. And even though it's way better for the environment, it's more expensive. So I wish they'd touch on that. Because unless it's something that's like fairly comparable in cost, or there'd be taxes that would make it comparable in cost, a company's not going to switch to it just to have better optics. They're going to switch to it only if it won't really affect their bottom line, or if the other things now, for some reason, like through taxes or shortages, no longer feasible for them to use. So I wish they'd gotten slightly more detail on that for the palm oil front, but I still thought it was really interesting and a solution to a problem that seemed very plausible, especially for the future. As something's new, it's usually more expensive to manufacture, and as you put more time and research into the development and money, at the end of the day, it'll get cheaper and cheaper. So that was interesting. Also, the cloths on the building, I thought that was cool. I know it wasn't like a huge focus of the documentary, but it was just something that seemed like very doable in a lot of places to help with like heat. I thought that was cool. Especially, I mean, like Seattle's been hot in the suburbs, so I was like, hey man, I wouldn't mind having some of that. I know I've been getting some better shades and stuff, more fans. I was thinking, oh, it's pretty interesting, especially because you could do it for like larger buildings pretty easily. Just drop the cloth all the way down. It's a lot easier than having shades in every window. I thought that was a pretty cool solution. Although they seem to be made out of plastic, so I was kind of like, it's not great, I guess. But, I mean, still better than a lot of other options. But I wish they kind of like were slightly more cynical. Not nearly cynical, but more, I guess more hard on like, if you just propose stuff and you don't talk about the reality of it, it gets shut down by people who are deniers a lot easier. If when you're proposing it, you also cover the other side, like you'll kind of like, this and that, like, yes, this is great, but it has these shortcomings. It's more convincing an argument than, oh, it's always great, and then you hear someone else say the shortcomings and you discarded the whole thing. I wish they kind of went more in depth on some of the shortcomings and some of their solutions. Like, for example, the curtains, like material costs would be ridiculous on that, and people aren't going to do it unless it's, again, economically viable. And the third one I thought was really good was I think it was probably the first one in the documentary they mentioned, which was the power stream between Germany and Norway. I had heard about that before, but had never seen it quite in detail how it was. I thought it was really well done and interesting. I was thinking, why don't we have something similar in North America? I mean, we could pretty easily do that. Canada's got a bunch of hydro. They have like some of the most lakes in the world. Washington, I mean, we got a bunch. Other parts of hydro, other parts of the U.S. have a bunch of wind. I mean, not even internationally. We can just do it within the nation, between states. And I feel like if we were to just expand our power grid like that, it would be much more efficient. I bet we could cut down on a lot of fossil fuels. Also, they're talking about nuclear, and I was kind of interested to see if that's viable. I've heard a lot of talk from either way, and I wish they kind of went slightly more in depth of that, because they said they were shutting down nuclear plants in France, and I was curious as to why. Because I've heard a lot of bad things about them, obviously, but I was wondering how much validity there was to that. And then for question 3, describe the... Oh yeah, sorry, that was question 3. For number 4... one way I've personally felt climate change in recent years is having the fires. The fires have been pretty mental. When I was a kid, I lived in Seattle my whole life. Dad lived in Seattle, Grandpa lived in Seattle, and they never really had fires like that. Fires were like a once a decade thing, and it would be like, yeah, some idiot peak summer flicked a cigarette in a bushfire, and it was contained in a couple days. It lost 5 acres of so-and-so's property. And now it's just like, oh yeah, no, it's just heat. Heat ignited a pile, or lightning, or natural causes, or a gender reveal party. That's a little bit rare. But like, it just the fires, and then the general heat in the summer too. Like, we had 110-degree summer 2 years ago. That never happened when I was a kid. So that's definitely a big impact of climate change. And then possible interventions would just be taxes. Like, just tax the wealthy people that are disproportionately contributing to climate change, and tax wealthy countries, I mean, U.S. included. Like, per capita, the U.S. has some of the highest negative contributions to climate change. Very wasteful country we are, like, just on food alone. If the U.S. were just not waste as much food as we do, we'd save a bunch of carbon right there. Like, we have starving people, and then, like, way too much food, and then that food production is a huge portion of our carbon emissions. Or, like, a great way we could also just public transport, walkable or bikeable cities. I mean, like, Seattle has horrible public transport. We keep, like, they add the H line, but all they did is they just, like, took away stops. So now it's faster. It's like, yeah, because it goes less places. So it's going to get there faster if it doesn't have as many stops on the way. Like, they should just have good public transport, and it would do a large reduction in the Seattle area for for carbon, my bad. And also, it could just run on either hydrogen if you're doing buses. It's a great place to do hydrogen. I mean, they have them right across the board in BC. You're going through a bus barn every day anyways, so you're reloading, or like twice a day, whatever you need to do. It's super doable, super feasible. Or like electric. Like we used to have electric trolleys here in the 20s, and they got rid of those for gas buses. We just bring those back. And we even had electric trains in the mountains. So I think those are things that possible interventions would be taken to make positive change. It'd be super easy and doable, but it threatens capital owners, so they don't. Yeah, that's my response. Sorry for the many tangents. Have a good one.